kind of crunch with the schedule is that the sessions before are only just finishing, so I imagine this audience will grow steadily, but I do want to get started because we only have 45 minutes of Sylvia's time. So these sessions here are a little bit different from some of the others you've seen today. This is an Ask an Expert session, and it means no formal presentation. This is your chance to put questions to Sylvia Lee, who's with us from Facebook, who can tell us all about the sustainability and climate work that she's doing there. So I'll put a few questions to Sylvia to kick off, but really I want you, the audience, to be driving this session. I totally want to hear your questions, and you can put them to me and to Sylvia in two ways. You can drop your questions into the Q&A tab. So if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see I'm just getting it up on my screen so I can tell you exactly where it is in the right place. Yeah, you should see a Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Make sure you're in the session Q&A, not the event Q&A, because I'm just going to be looking at the session Q&A. Drop your questions in there and I will relay them to Sylvia, or even better, come on the screen and put them direct to Sylvia and also share your thoughts on the discussions, that the things that we're talking about. We know that many people in the audience are also experts in their own right, and we would really love to have you on the screen contributing. Oh, and I didn't even get a chance to get my first question in. That is great. Olga, thank you for joining us on the screen. Do you have a question for Sylvia? Maybe some people do share their audio and video when they're not quite sure what they're letting themselves in for. So that may have been what happens here. So I'm going to kick started with just a really general scene setting question, Sylvia. Describe briefly your role there at Facebook and tell us about Facebook's climate commitments.
Yeah, I lead Facebook's net zero program. I also advise on our broader environmental stewardship work, including water work as well as biodiversity work. So yeah, I lead the overall net zero program, including the greenhouse gas inventory, the reduction, as well as the removal work.
Great, thank you. And Martina, thank you for joining us on screen. What's your question for Sylvia?
Yes, hi Sylvia, good to see you. I hope you can hear me. I am always very interested in Scope 3 travel-related emissions, and so it was great to see in Facebook's recent sustainability report that you're addressing and have a commitment now extending to Scope 3. And I think I noticed you have maybe about 13% of your Scope 3 emissions are coming from travel. That was obviously down in 2020. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of insight maybe into what your strategies or your thinking in terms of how to reduce that, given how difficult it really is to decarbonize air travel in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Martina. Great to see you again. So on business travel, yeah, 2020 was a strange year. 2019 is probably a better comparison. 2021 is also a little bit of a strange year. So I think overall, our reduction strategy is the same. We try to sort of standardize our reduction approach across all the categories. First, we try to choose less, do less, choose better, and then choose alternatives. And so with respect to business travel, on the choosing less, working with teams to see if, that travel is absolutely necessary. Are there other ways, as we've experienced in the last 2 years, that could be done remotely? Obviously, that's more of a conversation in 2022 because we're still not quite traveling as a business. The second one is choose better. And so we do work with our either airline partners or other partners to see, are there ways where we could choose perhaps slightly lower carbon intensity airline or other suppliers, as one option. And then last is choosing alternatives. And as you noted, with the business travel space, alternatives are difficult right now to come by. And so, and I want to first off saying for our business travel, I believe somewhere around 90% of our emissions is associated with our airlines. So we do look at hotels and ground transportation, but the bulk of it is air. And so early exploration, other perhaps fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, other things like that we can explore. But we want to first focus on the first two buckets that we talk about.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. Actually, Sylvia, I'm curious, to what extent can you make goals around employee travel? Are you able to say, like, we think in the future we can bring it down by X%? Just talk us through that.
Yeah, so, travel is a tricky category because of COVID. So we haven't yet set that kind of target, just because there's a lot of other factors that we need to consider. For example, the employees that are working remotely, how much is that in-person experience going to matter when we go back to the office? But in the medium to long term is something that we are definitely looking at.
Great, thank you. So Martina, you're welcome to stay on the screen or not. Choose.
Oh, I'm going to leave. I'll be too self-conscious to stay on the
thank
screen.
You for your question. Yeah.
But thank you.
So for everyone who's just joined us, we have Sylvia Lee from Facebook here talking about Facebook's climate commitments. And this is a different kind of session. It's an Ask an Expert session. You, the audience, drive this session. So you have two options. Please drop your questions, if you like, in the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Make sure you're in the session Q&A, not the event Q&A. And I see a couple there, which I'll come to in a minute. Or do what Martina just did, which is to jump on the screen and put your question direct to Sylvia. And also, please, if you do come on the screen, feel free to share your thoughts. I know there are many of you in the audience who also qualify as experts, and we would love to hear your comments as well as your questions. So let's go, Sylvia, to one of the questions I have here. So Adrian Steiner is asking, how does Facebook engage with its supply chain to reduce emissions? And he says, I assume this is where 70 to 80% of your total emissions reside. So does Adrian have that about right? And tell us about what you're doing with your supply chain partners.
Yeah, so our as part of our net zero goal to be net zero through our value chain by 2030, we've had to map our overall scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Because we were able to reduce our scope 2 so much, we actually reduced our scope 2 emissions by 94% in 2020 from 2017 level. You're right, the vast bulk of our emissions is in scope 3. And we also publish our entire scope 3 footprint. So suppliers is a big part of that. We, as I the framework that I laid out earlier on the choose less, choose better, and choose alternatives, the supplier engagement side is definitely in the last 2 bucket. And I'm happy to speak a little more on the first one later, but we have a very diverse set of suppliers. The suppliers that we work with range from hardware suppliers, our suppliers that we work with for construction of our buildings, all the way to suppliers that provide us with office services, to a lot of professional services firms, to marketing firms. So we have a very diverse set of suppliers, and for each type, they have different needs and different kinds of challenges that they deal with from an emissions perspective. So in general, we work with them to first understand their business with us, what the emissions look like. Also, we work with them to understand, look places where it makes sense for us to partner more strongly. So, for example, we have an energy audit program with some of our suppliers where that makes sense. With others, it's much more on just GHG accounting. It's just more basic So so there's different ways that we engage with our suppliers for our Scope 3 program.
Great, thank you. I was going to ask a follow-up, but the questions are coming so fast, I'm just going to try and get through some of them. And just remind anyone, you can jump on the screen and ask your question direct, and that will you'll be prioritized that way. Otherwise, I will work through the questions as quickly as I can. So Ruchi Shah is asking, Sylvia, can you talk about how Facebook thinks about green tariffs for its real estate portfolio?
I am afraid I'm not best placed to answer that question because I don't work on our real estate portfolio.
That's no problem. It's an enormous company, and we're not expecting you to ask every single question about it. So hold on, we have one more on air travel, but we did a bit on that already, so I'm gonna go on to the next one. So Tatiana Grossman is asking, would Facebook ever adopt sustainability as one of its top line goals alongside growth and engagement? So that's a curious question, Sylvia. How much can you say about that?
Yeah, I would say that's an interesting question. I would say I feel like sustainability is a top priority for the company. Is something that what we talked about earlier, a lot of our employees are very engaged in. Is something that our senior executives have posted and talked about. So sustainability, it feels to me is something that we work across the company on already.
Yeah, great. So Arnad Manas is asking, can you talk about your renewable energy strategy and the role of VPPAs? And what first step do you recommend for a company to take? And Sylvia, maybe I could just ask you to define VPPA for those who don't know what it means.
Yeah, VPPAs, virtual power purchase agreements. So our renewable energy strategy, so for the past 10 years, I think it's around 2010, we set a 100% renewable energy goal, and which we met in 2020. And our strategy is to work with our local utilities, and we make sure that the renewable energy that we work with is additional to the grid that we belong to. And these are new solar and wind projects that are within the same grid that we belong to. I think I might not have all the stats right, but I know that we are in most years we're typically like one of the top 5 procurers of renewable energy from the corporate space, and we will continue to do that as we grow. We, as part of that accounting with our utilities, we do, we use RECs as a accounting mechanism to account for those renewable energy for the emissions associated with that. We have a whole energy team that does a lot of that procurement. So I cannot speak specifically to VPPAs, unfortunately.
No problem. I think that hopefully gives everyone a rough idea. And a related question, this is from Masatoshi Ueno. Masatoshi, I'm sorry if I've mangled your second name there, who's asking, can you mention about sustainable data center, including construction process emission reduction?
Yeah, in our footprint, Scope 1 and Scope 2, as I mentioned, we had the 94% reduction. A lot of that is for the energy that we use at our data centers. And then the remaining 6%, we purchase carbon removal offsets to get to net zero for our operations. There's still a lot of emissions associated with our Scope 3 in that data center construction piece. So we've done a number of things. construction, similar to the business travel, is another hard to abate sector. So there's a number of things we've done. One is we have completed life cycle assessments of all of our construction sites. So we know, where our hotspots are. We've done a number of things. One is, I think for the first time, we use this EC3 calculator, embodied carbon calculator, to help our colleagues who design these data centers to have a way to see the different design and construction options, what the relative emissions are. On top of that, we have done a partnership with University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign to use AI to test different configurations of cement, for example, that will have lower greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, we also started to pilot some electrical construction equipment. As you know, most construction equipment is diesel, and so we've done some initial pilots to see how the electrification would work in a construction site. And then finally, all of our data centers are LEED Gold, and so that's something that we've prioritized and been doing for the past 10 years.
That's great. That's a really impressive list of initiatives. And as I remember, EC3 is an open source tool. Is that right? So if, just to sort of build on that, EC3 tool is a great tool, I think, developed by University of Washington and others, that basically allows you to kind of look at the different options for materials within a construction project and to figure out the embodied carbon associated with each one. So it's great to see it's getting use, and it would encourage others to check it out. Thank you. So just to remind everyone, for the folks who joined us recently, the audience are driving this session, please do put questions about Facebook's climate commitments to Sylvia. There is a queue that I'm trying to work my way through, but if you want to jump that queue, just click on the button to share your audio and video and join us on the screen, and you can put your questions to Sylvia direct. So there's one here from Anna Ma who's asking, what does the sustainability team at Facebook look like? What are the accountabilities and roles, and how have they been created to help Facebook reach follow its roadmap and goals?
Yeah, we have a pretty good sized sustainability team at this time. Net zero, which I lead, obviously is an important part, but we have other colleagues that work on other issues, like our responsible supply chain team that works on not just environmental issues, but also labor and human rights, conflict minerals, etc. We also have a team that engages on external and internal engagement, as well as team members that work on some of our product work. And then I just spent a lot of time talking about construction, the built environment. We also have teams that work on that. I'd be remiss if I don't also talk about our broader engagement within our employees, because while we have an amazing sustainability team, it wouldn't be possible for us to meet the work that we are doing as well as our goals without this broader employee engagement that we have. And earlier on, like before this session started, I was talking to Jim about never quite experienced in the last year or two just how engaged our employees have been around sustainability issues, particularly around climate change. And that also has helped us get not just a lot of great questions, a lot of great ideas, and it's so much more energy to move the work forward.
Yeah, and Sylvia, so for folks who missed that conversation right at the beginning, one thing that I thought was really interesting is that I said to you, like, you said that you got a big uptick in incoming questions, and I said, well, what do you think caused that? And you mentioned the fires last year and these crazy orange skies in San Francisco.
Yeah, we had a day last fall where the sun was just dark the entire day, and it felt like apocalypse was here. And that's just an example. Obviously, we have a very global set of global footprint for our employees, but we're seeing it in so many places, right? Like just the floods last week in Europe, fires in Australia, in Brazil, floods in Asia. So I think we're all experiencing it in slightly different ways, but I feel like there's collective understanding that this already is happening and we need to do something quickly. Yeah.
So let's go back to the questions. There's one here from Trevor McMahon, who's asking, are you working with any other companies in your field to develop new initiatives or standards, such as other hardware manufacturers or cloud companies, to engage the supply chain to make improvements?
Yeah, no, I think collaboration is absolutely key and really important. There's only, we're working really hard within our value chain, but we know that we're not going to be able to get there without broader collaboration. So we are part of REBA, Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. We're part of OCP, a lot of acronyms, Open Compute Project, as well as RBA, Responsible Business Alliance, where we're having a lot of these types of conversations with peers, with other companies. We're also committed to the Science Based Target Initiative as part of our net zero goal, and so these conversations, learning from each other, working together, is something that has always been important, but will be even more important in the years to come, just because, like I said, we cannot do this by ourselves.
Yeah, so just sort of spinning off that, Sylvia, I'd be interested in getting your perspective on the supplier relationship. We quite often hear about, if you think about it as carrots and sticks with your suppliers, there's a lot of talk about collaboration and the carrots, but then occasionally you'll hear companies advocate for more of a stick approach, and you'll hear some bigger companies with big supply chains feeding into the company saying, we're going to decline to work with certain suppliers if they don't meet, you can define your threshold. You could say, like, unless you have a science-based target, or some kind of short-term, some kind of equivalent commitment. Where do is Facebook thinking about this? Kind of what role does putting pressure on suppliers play for you?
Yeah, we're focusing on working closely with our suppliers as partners. We understand that there are other companies that take a sort of more stick approach. We're right now focusing on partnering with our suppliers. We also recognize that they're getting a lot of requests from others as well, and so we want to make sure that we meet them where they are.
Got it. Okay, let's go back to the questions. So, and Sylvia, I'm not sure if this falls under your remit at Facebook, so just feel totally free to say if it doesn't. But Mary McDonald is asking, what role does environmental and climate justice play in your goals, particularly around your data centers?
This is not totally squarely in my sort of area of expertise, but I will add, though, in a lot of our work, and this is not particular to data centers, and in a lot of the climate work we're looking at, for a good example is on the removal projects that we were looking at. Environmental justice was one of the criteria that we looked at as we looked at what kinds of projects we support. And one of the projects that we funded in the past year was a reforestation project in Eastern Africa, where it wasn't just about the reforestation, but also the the capacity building of these local farmers, the additional livelihoods that the projects provide to these communities. So it's something that we are incorporating more and more of in our work. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. So one here from Erin McNichol, who's asking about scope-free emissions for products use, and can you share any initiatives or thinking in that area?
Yeah, so we do calculate and we do calculate our emissions associated with the products that we produce as a company. So that is like the physical products. So that would be our Oculus, our Portal products, with other products that those emissions are typically sort of within the value chain of those manufacturer makers. So we do not report those.
Okay, and then there's a related two-part question from Joseph Stark, who's asking, does Facebook prefer to roll up its scope-free supplier emissions gross or net of offsets? And then how does it qualify offsets that suppliers propose to use, if net?
I love this question because this still gets in the weeds now. So yeah, we're starting to encounter this where suppliers, there's their emissions and then they purchase offsets sort of on top of that. We're keeping them separate because we want to focus on, our top priority is always reduction. We think it's great if the supplier wants to purchase offsets on top of that. As a company, we've chosen to focus more on removals. And so we're starting to keep track of the emissions and reductions as well as the offsets separately. And so we think in the future we will continue to do that. But I don't think there's like a recognized standard on how to approach it. So would love to see also how other companies and what other approaches there are. But for us, yeah, we're focusing on, we're not counting the offsets.
Interesting. Yeah. So Joseph, I don't know if you work for a company that is tackling the same problem, but if you do, tell us how you're dealing with it. And just so I understand, Sylvia, because it's a really interesting question, I think you're saying that for your suppliers, you're really focusing on you're not counting the offsets. When you're looking at the supplier's footprint, you try and leave offsets off to the side, just look at the steps that they're taking with their own emissions. And does that change, though, if the suppliers are applying removal credits to their emissions, or are you just saying like any kind of offset, we'll just put it off to the side, whether it's an avoided emission or a removed emission?
We have not yet experienced if the suppliers purchase removal offsets. I think if they do, I think we might look at that a little more carefully. But so far, we've only experienced our suppliers purchasing the avoided emissions offsets. So we capture that information, but we don't use it right now.
Got it. Okay, another question. Pete Gossens is asking, beside the recent release of the sustainability report, what are you most proud of / excited about in terms of Facebook's sustainability efforts?
That's interesting. What am I most proud of? I am most proud of the net zero 2030 value chain goal that we're working towards. I know we're still year one of a 10-year roadmap, but I am really proud of not just where we are today, but the support that we're getting to realize that. as well as a lot of fear of how we're going to get there. And I imagine this is true for many folks. It's going to be really difficult, and it's going to be very difficult for the world. And so it's sort of excitement and a little bit worried, all at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you for being frank about that. We have another question from Patrick Neese, who's asking, how is Facebook handling employee work from home related emissions during COVID, which I imagine that was a challenge for your usual carbon footprint calculating system.
Yeah. So we worked with one of our consultants who published a white paper on how to calculate telecommuting emissions, which we include in the employee commute. I can't remember what category that is within Scopefree. So we included that for both electricity and natural gas, and we had to make some assumptions on what some of those numbers are. And then as part of that, our renewable energy team also procured additional renewable energy to cover the emissions associated with electricity for our employees working from home. So we, in the long term, we anticipate that perhaps up to half of our employees will be working remote. We anticipate we'll be doing that kind of telecommuting calculations from this point forward to make sure that we capture the fullness of our footprint.
Right, I actually have a follow-up on that, but just to remind everyone, do put your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, or click the button to share audio and video. You can come and jump on the screen and put them direct to Sylvia. So Sylvia, I'm curious with this. So 50% working remotely in the long term, that's a big, I imagine, I don't know what the percentage was pre-COVID. I imagine it was much smaller. So a potentially big shift there. How does that affect your strategy on renewables going forward? I imagine it's much harder to influence, if everyone's in one place, you have a relatively small number of supplier relationships when it comes to buying electricity. But if everyone is at home, it's much harder to control where that electricity comes from.
Yeah, I think for the most part, because we procure renewable energy in the same grid as our offices, at least for right now, it maps reasonably well. In the future, we will have to see. Right now, most of our employees are still working within, certain geographies, but we will see what it looks like in the future. And then we will, as needed, we'll make adjustments.
Got it. So we have a new question from Aline Ribas, who's asking, did your scope 2 and 1 emissions increase during COVID due to increased airflow requirements and to less warm bodies in office buildings, which is not something I would have thought about, but kind of makes sense?
That's interesting. Our scope, let me think. From 2019 to 2020, our scope 1 and 2 decreased. I think I'm not going to quote numbers. I think we were at 252,000 in 2019, and we're at like 44,000 or something like that in 2020. A lot of that is from renewable electricity. Our scope 1, I think it either stayed relatively stable. I cannot remember off the top of my head, but I'm gonna posit that it was pretty stable. There's some things that, for example, the shuttles that we run as a company, like that wasn't running as much. So And then maybe what she was talking about might have increased, but net, it was pretty stable.
Okay, great. So we haven't touched much on offsets, and I would love to hear your strategy there. Tell us how you think about use of offsets in your net zero plans, and then like what kind of offsets are you focusing on and why?
Yeah, so our main focus is on reduction. And so that's where we're putting vast majority of our energy on. And then for residual emissions that we cannot reduce, we do work to purchase carbon removal offsets. So we did that for our Scope 1 and 2, and we will be doing so for our Scope 3. We chose to focus on carbon removals as opposed to other types of offsets to focus on getting to that net zero. So what we focus on a number of things. We know that in the carbon removal space, what is more readily available right now are the nature-based solutions. So that's what we've been focusing on and will continue to focus on. We would like to look more at the technological side of carbon removals, especially as we get closer to 2030, and look for ways where we could support that. From the carbon removal sort of broadly perspective, I think our criteria is fairly typical to others. We want to make sure it's additional, that's not causing leakage somewhere else. We want to make sure it's longer term, it's durable. But on top of that, I think what I talked about on the environmental justice earlier is we also look for opportunities where we could support climate justice and equity. We also, as much as possible, look for projects that also support biodiversity and water, because we like to take a systemic approach to this. And then we also recognize that they're great existing standards, but the standards could also be improved. And so we do conduct additional due diligence on top of existing standards when we select them, and overall the space could use a lot more, especially for some of the less well developed carbon removal options. So the session earlier talked a little bit around regenerative agriculture or some of the other types of removals, and so we would like to see how the space develop and potentially what our role is in that.
Great. So just to remind everyone, we're finishing at 3 o'clock Pacific. So we have just a little bit over 5 minutes. So do put your questions to Sylvia now, so I can make sure I can try and get them in before the end of the session. Please add them to the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen in the session bit, not the event bit. Just to dig a bit deeper in removals, Sylvia, I know, I've spoken to a lot of companies who say one of the things they find two things they find very challenging about removals. One is there just aren't many, so there's a supply issue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there. And another one is that the due diligence is very challenging, in that whoever it is selling the removal will be making a series of claims about how, about avoidance and leakage and all this kind of stuff. And it sounds very good, but actually sort of digging deeper, it proves to be very hard. So is that something you do in-house? Do you have a consultancy that you work with? Tell us a bit more about that process. Yes.
I will answer your second one because I had forgotten your first one, so apologies. Maybe we can repeat the first one later. On the due diligence, we have a 2-step process. We do additional due diligence in-house. And then we also engage with external consultants that provide an additional layer of due diligence. We recognize this is probably not that scalable for the space. because if we want to see more carbon removal projects and uptake, I mean, it's something that, of course, like we can do, but we would love to see more standards, more coming together, so that not everyone is redoing, you know, a high level of due diligence over and over again, and so it feels like there's efficiencies to be gained there. I forgot your first question.
The first question was about supply, and I'm partly motivated because Lucas Chopper from Microsoft was speaking earlier today. He talked about the RFP they put out for removals, and I think they wanted to buy 1 million tons of removals. And then once they've got rid of the replies to the RFP, which were actually avoided emissions, and they just focused just on the removals, there was only about 1 million tons in there. So they pretty much bought like everything they were offered, which made me think this market is not really as developed as we need it to be.
Yes, that is, yes, supply, yes. We I think last year we purchased around 145,000 tons, so we're not quite at Microsoft scale, but yes, we experienced similar challenges where there's a supply issue. And so one of the things that we're starting to look at is how do we participate in encouraging more of these projects to happen, and knowing that there's also a lead time, and sometimes it could be a couple of years. I mean, reforestation could be 10 years or more, right? To get the removals that we will need in the future. So yeah, we're experiencing similar challenges. Probably not quite at Microsoft scale, but it is real, and we want to be part of developing that market.
And so Pete Gossens has a follow-up question about that due diligence question we were just talking about. He's asking, do you lean on third-party consultants, or do you have scientists internally that can help you with that?
We do. We have a lot of amazing scientists internally, but for the due diligence on our carbon removal, we have someone in-house who, as you know, the carbon removal space, there's a lot of different disciplines within that, right? So, someone who might be really knowledgeable on reforestation might not be as knowledgeable on blue carbon versus direct air capture, right? So depending on the type, some of it we might have some in-house expertise, but some of it we work with external parties to do that additional due diligence.
Great. So Sylvia, we just got 2 minutes left. So what I would love to hear from you, just to use what time we have, is what does the next few years look like for the sustainability team at Facebook? Like, what are your priorities? What if they're a success these next couple of years, what are you hoping to achieve?
My hope is that at least I can speak on the net zero side. This first year or last couple of years has been very much building the foundation of what is needed to deliver the reduction that we would like to see, as well as the building the net zero program. My hope in the next few years is that we can get to the implementation, where hopefully we know that it will take a little bit of time to work with suppliers to start seeing some of the reduction that we would like to see. My hope is in a few years we can get that engine going to such a way where we're starting to see the reductions that we're hoping to see.
Right. And maybe just as my last question, what keeps you up at night when you think about those goals? Like what are the one or two things that you worry about barriers not being able to overcome that might prevent those things from happening?
For me personally, it is that broader ecosystem beyond Facebook. Is what are some of the other policies that will happen? What are some of our partners going to do? that will have a huge impact on our Scope 3. And it is very exciting. At the same time, we don't have as much control the same way that Scope 1 and 2 that we have. So that's what worries me. But also exciting, because we do depend on that broader ecosystem in order for us to achieve our goal.
Yeah, thank you. So we're at time. Sylvia, I so appreciate you coming here, being willing to take any question that was thrown at you, given like the vast size of your company and all the different things it's involved in. But I thought that was really great. Thank you so much for giving us an insight into what you're doing. And that is the end of day one of Verge Net Zero. I hope to see lots of you back tomorrow. We'll kick off the keynotes at 10 a.m. Pacific. And then just like today, we'll dive into a bunch of breakout sessions and end today just as we are, and tomorrow just as we are today, with some more of these Ask an Expert sessions. So thank you so much for your time, and hope to see lots of you tomorrow. Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Bye.